right, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
On behalf of Father Simeon and myself for the religious education of St. Andrews, we would like to welcome you to our Lenten lecture series this year. We would like to welcome Dr. John Fotopoulos, our first speaker of this season. Archon Dr. John of St. George Church in Cherville, Indiana, and the Holy Apostles Church in Westchester, Illinois, was invested as an Archon in 2017 and conferred with the Officium Didaskalos του Evangeliu, meaning that he has the unique title of Archon Teacher of the Gospels, which means that his unique job from the Ecumenical Patriarchate is to be a teacher of the Church, which is a beautiful conference upon him by our great Patriarch. Dr. Fotopoulos chants at both parishes and is the homilist at the Holy Apostles Church. Dr. Fotopoulos earned an MDiv, a Master of Divinity degree at Holy Cross, where he was the class valedictorian, and a PhD at Loyola University. He's a professor of religious studies at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, specializing in New Testament and early Christian studies. Dr. Fotopoulos is a scholar and prolific writer, 4 books, 24 articles, and 21 papers, and a lecturer, including lectures in Athens several years ago titled Baptism in the Pauline Church in the First Century. So needless to say, the plaudits of Dr. Fotopoulos are many, and we are very, very blessed, very, very lucky to have him speak to us today on the Evangelist St. Mark and Lenten Discipleship. We'd like to thank you for coming, Doctor, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for having me. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this evening. My thanks to all of you for taking the time to come, and to the entire parish of St. Andrews for hosting this beautiful event following our Pre-Sanctified Liturgy. So I don't want to go too long tonight, because I know it's a weeknight and you've all already had a long day, but I just wanted to touch a little bit tonight on a few important themes in the Gospel of Mark. With the exception of the first Sunday in Lent, the Sunday of Orthodoxy, where our Gospel in the Divine Liturgy is taken from the Gospel according to St. John, the rest of the Sundays in Lent in the Orthodox Church, we hear readings from the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, if I had to say, if you really pressed me, what's your favorite Gospel? I would tell you the Gospel of Mark is my favorite Gospel. Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. That's not why it's my favorite, but it is the shortest. It's also in some ways the least polished of the 4 Gospels. Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, probably didn't get an A in writing composition in school. And although not being a very polished writer, the evangelist Mark was certainly a genius in the way that he wrote and arranged his gospel in order to tell the story of Jesus for his particular church in light of the context in which they were living in the first century. So for every Sunday from here on out, until we get to Palm Sunday, which is not technically part of Lent in the Orthodox Church. I don't know how many of you are aware of that Lent stops the Friday before the Saturday of Lazarus. So the Saturday of Lazarus and Palm Sunday are their own liturgical thing. And then Holy Week is obviously its own separate entity from Lent itself. So until we get to the Friday before the Saturday of Lazarus, the Sundays from now on in Divine Liturgy, we will hear from the Gospel according to St. Mark. And as you listen to these readings every Sunday, and I would encourage you all, if you haven't read the Gospel of Mark from cover to cover, to do so. It's only 16 chapters and odd verses. Won't take you that long to read it, and it really will be worthwhile. So maybe you might want to consider adding that as one of your spiritual exercises during Lent. And I think that the story that Mark tells us about Jesus and about the disciples in the Gospel of Mark can be especially rewarding for us on our Lenten journey towards Pascha. I'd like to focus a little bit tonight on Mark's portrait of the disciples in his Gospel. I think it's not an understatement to say that Mark does not paint a very flattering portrait of the 12 disciples. They are portrayed quite differently in Mark's Gospel than they are in the other 3 Gospels. If I had to pick one word to describe the disciples in Mark's Gospel, I might say obtuse. Another word that comes to mind is blind, misunderstanding. The disciples just don't get things that Jesus says in Mark's Gospel. Time and time again, they fail to understand what Jesus teaches them. They fail to understand Jesus's parables. Jesus will engage in various actions, and they don't understand their significance. Jesus gives them private explanations in Mark's Gospel that others are not privy to, and they still really don't fully understand what Jesus is trying to tell them. A really obvious example of the disciples' misunderstanding and blindness in Mark's Gospel happens when Jesus goes to pray in Gethsemane before his arrest. And he exhorts his disciples to stay awake with him while he prays. And 3 times his disciples fall asleep. The disciples earlier in the gospel plead their loyalty to Jesus, that no matter what happens, they're not going to leave him. They're going to stick by him. And then when Jesus is arrested in Mark's Gospel, the disciples all run away. They flee. So they fail not only to understand Jesus' teachings, they also fail to understand what Jesus says about his impending crucifixion and death. And at the end of the gospel, as if that wasn't enough, the disciples, after they run away when Jesus is arrested, fail to go to the tomb like the women do. So during Jesus' lifetime, the disciples can't fully grasp what Jesus says about himself or about his destiny on the cross. Very interesting as well, the disciples in the Gospel of Mark do not understand that Jesus is the Son of God. We're told in the very first verse of the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is the Son of God. But the disciples do not know or understand that in Mark's Gospel. They do in the other Gospels, but they don't in Mark. God announces that Jesus is the Son of God at Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. But again, the disciples don't hear or know that. In fact, this may surprise you, in Mark's Gospel, no human being knows or understands that Jesus is the Son of God during Jesus' lifetime. Let me say that again. No human being knows or understands that Jesus is the Son of God during Jesus' lifetime in Mark's Gospel. Now you may be thinking, what about Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Theotokos? She plays a very minor role in Mark's Gospel. She plays a bigger role in Matthew's Gospel, and especially a big role in Luke's Gospel, which is also obviously in John's Gospel, but in Mark's Gospel, she does not play a big role. And this is Mark's way of trying to convey an important theological point, which I'll try to flesh out here in a minute as best I can. And that is, no human being could fully understand that Jesus was the Son of God during Jesus' lifetime. Only supernatural powers could understand that Jesus was the Son of God. So God certainly knows that Jesus is the Son of God. And also the demons who cry out when Jesus does exorcisms and casts out demons. They cry out, "We know who you are. You are the Holy One of God. You are the Son of God." And what does Jesus do? "Shut up," he tells them. He quiets those demons. Frequently also in Mark's gospel, when Jesus heals people, he tells them not to say anything to anyone, which seems almost kind of counterintuitive. If Jesus is trying to get people to follow him, why would he tell other people not to talk about him after he heals them? And so scholars who have studied this have given this theme in Mark's gospel a name. It's called the Messianic secret. And it's just, this term, the Messianic secret, is just trying to convey that there's this element of secrecy in Mark's gospel about who Jesus is, the Son of God, what he does, and how people understand him. These themes really come to the forefront in the middle of Mark's gospel. The middle section of Mark's gospel, and there's different ways to kind of divide up Mark's gospel if you were going to do an outline of Mark's gospel. But the middle section, beginning in 8:22, all the way to the end of chapter 10, focus especially on the disciples and their misunderstanding about who Jesus is. And if you could take a moment to look at the handout that I gave you, a few highlights here from Mark chapter 8, 8:22. We have Jesus healing the blind man at Bethesda. They came to Bethesda. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. So in secrecy, he's going to do the healing. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. And he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." So we have this very interesting healing of this blind man by Jesus, which Jesus does in 2 stages. And you see that after the first time Jesus puts saliva on the man's eyes and touches him, he says, "Can you see anything?" And the man says in verse 24, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Oh, that makes a lot of sense. What does that mean? Probably something like partial vision, blurry vision. It's almost like if you go to, I don't know, Great America and you or the Museum of Science and Industry, and you stand in one of those mirrors that make your shape look distorted. That's what I think Mark is conveying here. So he has partial vision. And then Jesus puts his hands on the blind man's eyes a second time, and the man looks intently, and his sight was restored, and he sees everything clearly. So he goes from partial vision to full vision. What's the very next text that Mark gives us? Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" I mean, that is the chief question of Mark's gospel. To answer the question of who is Jesus, that's the focus of Mark. And they answered, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. More secrecy? Who do people say I am? Well, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. No. Who do you say that I am? You're the Messiah. Sounds pretty good. Don't tell anybody. Shh. Next scene. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. So this is the first of what we call the passion predictions in Mark's gospel. There are 3 passion predictions in this middle section of Mark's gospel, where Jesus very clearly tells the disciples what's going to happen to him. The Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and after 3 days, rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So Peter takes Jesus aside after Jesus says he's going to suffer and die, and Peter rebukes him. No, Jesus, don't say that. I don't want to hear that. And this is Peter's beloved teacher and Lord, Jesus. I don't want to hear that. Verse 33, but turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus just called Peter Satan. Why? We just had Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah. But Peter does not fully understand what kind of Messiah Jesus is. Jesus is not going to be a victorious military king type Messiah riding into Jerusalem on a stallion or in a chariot. Jesus is the Son of Man who must suffer and be crucified. Anything less is from Satan. It is a partial understanding of who Jesus is. So Peter and the disciples have partial vision, partial insight into who Jesus is, but they don't yet see fully. Just like the blind man in 8:22 to 26, they need a second touch. They need to see everything clearly by accepting the cross. Not only for Jesus, but for themselves. And this takes us to 8:34. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." So those people who want to be true followers, true disciples of Jesus, have to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow Jesus. So it means not only accepting the necessity of the cross for Jesus, but accepting the necessity of the cross for oneself. And if we had more time, I would love to go through all of chapter 8, 9, and 10 with you, but we might need a semester for that. Let me just say briefly, if you read it on your own, you'll see the disciples continue to show that they don't understand Jesus fully or properly in those chapters. And it will culminate with Jesus healing the blind Bartimaeus at the end of chapter 10. And Mark has used here an ancient Greek rhetorical device. In English, we would call it intercalation. In Latin, they call it an inclusio. I think a good way for us to think about it is it's just a market sandwich. He's got the bread on each side of the sandwich. He's got the disciples' misunderstanding in the middle with the passion predictions. He's got the healing of the blind man at Bethesda on the one side, and the other bracket is the healing of blind Bartimaeus. And when he heals blind Bartimaeus at the end of chapter 10, blind Bartimaeus, who now sees, right? So he can see clearly. What does he do when he gets his sight? He follows Jesus on the way. Or another way we might translate that is, he follows Jesus on the road. And the road in Mark's gospel is not just like beautiful Lakeshore Drive out here next to the church. The road, or the way in Mark's gospel, is the road to the cross. In Mark's gospel, Jesus makes one journey from Galilee in the north down to Jerusalem in the south to the cross. The road in Mark's gospel is a journey to the cross and Jesus' death. So with blind Bartimaeus following Jesus on the road, he is following Jesus on the road to the cross. He is giving us an example of proper discipleship in Mark's gospel. So to kind of tie things up here together, how can this be of any value to us in terms of our Lenten journey? I think it's no accident that the church has given us Mark's gospel on all of these Sundays in Lent. It's a way to remind us of the importance of faithful discipleship and following Jesus on the road to the cross. And I think we are especially blessed in our Orthodox tradition with our rich liturgical life, all throughout Lent, but especially in Holy Week, where liturgically we participate in Jesus's journey to the cross. We feel, we experience with all our senses Jesus's betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion, and finally, of course, his glorious resurrection. So as we go through Lent, and especially as we go through Holy Week, hopefully we can keep the Gospel of Mark and his themes in mind, and especially remember the importance of discipleship. And that means experiencing the cross with Jesus during Holy Week, and in our own lives as we share in suffering with others, as we are sensitive to the suffering of others, and as we do whatever we can to alleviate the suffering of others. So with these readings, the church gives us this opportunity to refocus on our calling as disciples of Christ, striving to do his will, striving to understand him, striving to see Jesus clearly as the Son of God. Thanks for having me this evening. Any questions at all? Any questions, Father?
So, given this this beautiful description of the disciples failing utterly, I think it's very interesting if you get a little meta with it, in the sense that Mark's gospel is essentially the Apostle Peter's gospel, since he was his disciple, which means that that interlude that you gave us of "Get thee behind me, Satan," is essentially St. Peter telling his disciple Mark, yeah, this is what happened and what he said to me, showing his humility. Because it seems to me that most people, that would be one of the things that we wouldn't want necessarily people to know about us.
Yeah.
And yet Peter leaves it in to show that that was an important part of his journey towards that salvation. So obviously, since you know these scriptures inside and out, what do you think that conveys to us with your overall message of discipleship as the overarching theme within the theme, I guess?
Yeah, Peter's such an important character in Mark's gospel. He is the leader of the 12 disciples. He frequently in Mark's gospel speaks on behalf of the 12. He is representative of the 12. And it's easy to think about Peter's denial of Jesus, that he denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. As a matter of fact, in Mark's gospel, he denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows twice, which is a kind of an interesting detail that only Mark has. No other evangelist has the cock crow twice. 1 cock crow is enough. Mark likes to use these, what we call Markan doublets, these little double things, these little double repeating things. It's just one of his stylistic features. But it's easy to think that Peter is the only one who denied Jesus. But in Mark's gospel, Jesus predicts that they will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. You will all become deserters, he tells the disciples. And they plead loyalty to Jesus. No, no way. No, we're going to be with you. And when the time comes and Jesus gets arrested, they all take off. So it's not just Peter. Peter will, of course, kind of double back and follow Jesus from a distance to kind of see what's going to happen. And that's when he will deny Jesus 3 times when Jesus is having his hearing with the Jewish religious authorities. One more quick detail, and this is why the Gospel of Mark is so worth reading, a detail that only Mark has. When the disciples all flee, there is one other additional character that's only in Mark's Gospel, and that is a young man, a follower of Jesus, a young man, and Mark says he was wearing nothing but a linen cloth. In other words, he had a garment around his waist. And if you think about Jesus and the disciples, it's Passover, time of Passover in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is very crowded. Most pilgrims don't sleep in Jerusalem for Passover. They sleep outside of the city, like Jesus is doing with the disciples in the Mount of Olives. It's cooler, it's green space. You're sleeping out. Maybe it's a warm spring night. You only have one pair of clothes. So this disciple's basically sleeping in the ancient equivalent of his underwear. And when they arrest Jesus, Mark says, one young man was following him wearing nothing but a linen cloth. And they grabbed hold of him, the arresters did, and he ran off naked. It's if I was making the Gospel of Mark the movie, I would really milk that scene for all it's worth, maybe do a slow-mo. It seems kind of peculiar, but that's Mark telling us that the disciples have not only run away, they have been exposed. Literally, he runs away naked. They've been stripped of everything that they said. They've been exposed. Their loyalty has shown to be shallow. They have run away.
Isn't on Holy Thursday night, don't we have Mark, a passage from Mark as one of the 12 Gospels?
I believe we do. I believe we do. I don't have it in front of me, but I think that's right.
Doctor, for that verse that you just gave us of the servant that ran away naked, which is, endemic of the disciples and the nakedness of their disbelief, do you think that, especially since that's within the Holy Week passages, that is sort of a dichotomy against the righteous patriarch Joseph, whose nakedness is shown, the exact same thing happens, but his righteousness is shown as opposed to his faithlessness? That's
a great question. I mean, in many of these gospel passages, I think it's certain that the evangelists are making their own kinds of connections with Old Testament themes and figures. So that wouldn't surprise me. That would not surprise me. Yes.
Father, why don't you think that Mark has anything about the infancy narratives? He starts off, and it's almost like, that's the beginning is the baptism. He doesn't have anything about Mary or anything about the birth.
Yes, right. That's a great question. So if you read Mark's gospel, you will see after a couple prophetic verses, he jumps right into the ministry of John the Baptist. And then Jesus will get baptized by John. There's no birth narrative in Mark's gospel. There's no Christmas narrative. There's also no birth narrative in John's gospel. And I think how one answers this question, I mean, different people might answer this differently. I think one way to answer it has to do with how we date the Gospels and what we think about the order of the Gospels. And I, not speaking for the Orthodox Church, not that we have an official position on this, but in my just opinion as a scholar who happens to be Orthodox, I would argue that Mark's Gospel and John's Gospel are the 2 earliest Gospels. And because of that, they're not focused on the birth of Jesus. Questions about Jesus' birth. Did everybody always know he was divine? Were there any signs surrounding his birth? What did his mother think about it? I think these are questions that Christians are going to ask more later as the movement grows and spreads, and then those kinds of traditions can be incorporated in the Gospels, such as in Matthew and Luke. But in Mark's Gospel, I think it's the earliest, it's rough, it's not his focus. And in John's Gospel, John's Gospel begins with a prologue about the Word who became flesh. So Jesus as the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, who becomes incarnate, who becomes human. So in John's Gospel, it's a very different question. John is not concerned that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, as in Matthew and in Luke. John, if you ask John, I think, the evangelist, where is Jesus from? He would not say he is from Bethlehem. He would say he is from heaven. He is the Logos who has become incarnate. In other words, the town that he's born in is really a secondary issue for John's Gospel.
So, Doctor, to kind of piggyback on his question, maybe you could address a little bit kind of what was the historical time of when Mark was written, as to why the immediacy was necessary, who was emperor, what was happening, and what was going on with the other disciples as to why.
Such a good question, and really something I should have touched on in the main part of the talk, which is Mark's church is clearly a church that is undergoing suffering, persecution, and death for their faith in Jesus. And those issues are directly related to Mark's portrait of the disciples, right? That the disciples kind of run away from suffering and death. When you start to read the story, it would be natural if you're an early Christian to identify with the disciples. Peter, the 12, like they're kind of the heroes in Christian tradition. And as you kind of follow the story in Mark, they kind of keep failing and kind of change your mind about the kind of the hero designation that one might have of them. And that's Mark's way of saying, I think, we in our church, in Mark's church, are experiencing suffering and death. And in some ways, we are doing what the disciples did. And we have to do better. We have to be faithful. We have to see clearly. We have to be willing to carry our cross and follow Jesus. So many scholars would say that Mark's gospel was probably written in Rome. Some might argue for Syria. In terms of all the gospels, they're kind of our best guesses in terms of dates. Anywhere from 60 to 70 AD, I think, is a pretty reasonable hypothesis for Mark's gospel. Most scholars would say that Matthew and Luke are a little bit later, somewhere between 70 to maybe as late as 85 or something. And then John's gospel, if you read any biblical scholarship, a lot of times, like, the easy answer is John's gospel is the last gospel. It was written in the 90s, but it's probably more complicated than that. John's gospel seems like it's probably been revised a few times for the edition we have. So just kind of like you get a textbook and get a second edition and third edition. And the reason why we think that is there's material in the Gospel of John that doesn't flow well. Something seems like Jesus tells the disciples at the Last Supper, I'm not going to talk much more with you. Let's get up and be on our way. So it's over. And then he talks to them for 3 more chapters after that. So there are these kind of abrupt literary transitions in John's gospel that makes you think that there's been some reworking of that gospel that happened, either by the evangelist himself or maybe by a disciple of the evangelist. So maybe in the final edition that we have, maybe we might want to date it around 90, but it's got material, I would argue, that goes all the way back to the 60s. So in its first edition, it's every bit as early as Mark's gospel.
That's a good way to put it, because we're dealing with a span of time, maybe about 20 years.
Yes.
So, you can say it's the complete form.
Right.
But absolutely, not everything flows very well.
No, it does not. And there's material that's repetitive, things that, Jesus already said, and then he says again in a little bit of a different way. These are probably traditions that are in John's church, and the evangelist doesn't want to lose them.
Yeah.
And so they get incorporated, even if it doesn't flow as smoothly as we might want to. And remember, there's no word processing then, so it's not like you can just go back and delete. It's a little tougher. to edit.
Do we have any more questions on this side of the room?
So you said that in the beginning, you prefaced the talk by saying that in Mark's gospel, the disciples did not know who Jesus was, but in the other gospels, they do know. Which is it?
So I'm taking that this is a historical.
That's a big deal.
This is a historical question, right?
Yeah.
And a historical question is a bit different than a literary question, right? Because we have 4 literary presentations of the disciples in our 4 gospels. The historical reality is a whole nother question, and different scholars would answer that quite differently depending on what they understand, how they understand the historical Jesus and his movement and so on and so forth.
But if they didn't know who he was, why were they following him?
So, again, so different people would answer this differently. Some people might say that they were following Jesus because they thought that he was Israel's Messiah. Remember, too, in Israel and Judaism, there is not an expectation that the Messiah is going to be God. It's going to be divine. This is something quite unique to the Jesus movement. I don't know how up you are on your, Jewish messianic claimants in the 1st century, but there were a good number of them. Yeah. And Jews in general did not, not all Jews had messianic expectations. They didn't all expect a Messiah. And those who didn't expect the Messiah to be God, to be divine. They expected him to be a great military king, or a priest, or a wise teacher, or a prophet like Moses. There were different ideas about what the Messiah would be like. Okay?
And Elena, that goes even back to the devil himself. If you look to the temptations of Christ, those temptations don't make sense if the devil is attacking the literal Son of God.
Yeah.
What he's doing is exactly as Dr. John said, is off of that idea that the messianic person is not necessarily going to be divine.
Yes, and also, I totally agree with that. The only other thing I would leave you with is to think that whatever the disciples thought about Jesus during Jesus' lifetime as a kind of a historical matter, we in our tradition would firmly assert whatever they thought of him ahead of time. After Jesus' death and resurrection, that all changes. And that's a big theme in John's gospel, right? That you can't think about Jesus the same way as you did prior to the death and resurrection. Everything changes. And so they see things kind of through resurrectional lenses or resurrectional glasses. And that colors even the way they think about things that Jesus said or did. They think about it now through the crucifixion and especially the resurrection. So that reshapes. It's almost like, it's kind of a trite example. It's almost like if you knew somebody like, in high school and you hung out with them and they were a good person and, maybe they were a class president and they were really wonderful. Like I said, it's a really trite example. And then later in their life, they become president of the United States. You might look back and say, oh, I always knew.
Yeah.
They were going to be great. Or I remember they told me this one thing and I didn't see it then. Yes, you put the pieces together. Right? And plus, also too, we believe in our tradition that they've been given the gift of the Holy Spirit, which inspires and enlightens them to see things that they didn't understand. They go back, Luke's gospel is very clear about this, how the disciples go back and study the scriptures now. Jesus opens the scriptures to the disciples on the journey to Emmaus. They go back and they read things that they thought they already knew, and now they understand it totally different now.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having me.
So on behalf of Marianne Nichols and Paula Bork, who are the chairpersons of the Ann and Theodore Phillips lecture series of St. Andrew, we want to thank Dr. John for giving us his magnificent telling of the Gospel of John, putting in the context of Great Lent and Holy Weekend, inspiring us all in our Lenten journey of discipleship and how we ought to behave ourselves. We thank you all for coming to join us tonight. We thank all those that were present online. Ordinarily at this time we would be giving Dr. John the gift from the parish. Unfortunately, our representative fell sick tonight and was not able to make it, and she sends her apologies. So, Doctor, we will send
Not
your
necessary.
gift.
Not my pleasure to be here.
But we are so grateful to have you. And Father Simeon, thank you for putting this all together with our lecture series from the metropolis. And we are so we are grateful. Everyone have a wonderful night. And if you haven't had a chance, please greet Dr. John and ask him any questions you might not have had a chance to ask during the presentation. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Costa, for preparing a wonderful meal, and the Parish Council for hosting tonight.
Okay. Okay, all right.